A racist white lawyer insults a black man in the parking lot outside the courthouse, thinking that the black man is a nobody. However, he gets instant karma when he walks into the courtroom and sees the black man. Marcus Williams pulled his sleek black sedan into the courthouse parking lot, scanning the rows of cars for a spot. The mid-morning sun beat down on the lot, the heat visible in the shimmering air above the asphalt. His air conditioning hummed softly, but even that didn't seem to dull the sharp tension that often accompanied his trips to court. He had a big case today, and every step leading up to it mattered. As he turned his blinker on and angled toward an open parking space, a silver luxury SUV whipped around the corner without warning, screeching into the spot Marcus had clearly signaled for. Marcus slammed on his brakes, his heart hammering from the near miss. His hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as he stared at the vehicle now parked across the lines, taking up 2 spaces. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing heavily, his pulse racing not from fear but from frustration. He had seen this kind of entitlement before. Someone who believed that their time, their space, their needs were more important than anyone else's. As he exhaled slowly, debating whether it was worth confronting the driver, the door of the SUV flew open. Out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man, his gray designer suit crisp, sunglasses perched arrogantly on his head. Marcus watched as the man adjusted his tie, his movements dripping with superiority. "Hey!" the man barked, his voice cutting through the thick air as he stormed toward Marcus's car. "You almost hit me. You know that?" Marcus blinked, astonished. He rolled down his window halfway, his eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" The man stopped just short of the driver's side window, his face twisted into a scowl of annoyance. "I said, you almost hit me. Pay attention next time." He folded his arms across his chest, his posture daring Marcus to challenge him. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice even. "I had my signal on for that space. You cut me off." The man cocked his head slightly, like he hadn't heard right. Then a slow, dismissive smile spread across his face. "That's so?" He glanced back at his SUV, then at Marcus's sedan as though inspecting something beneath him. "Well, maybe you should have been quicker." Marcus stared at him, incredulous. "Quicker? I was already—" The man waved a hand, cutting him off. "Doesn't matter now, does it? You can find another spot, can't you?" His tone was patronizing, the kind you use when speaking to someone you believe is beneath you. For a second, Marcus considered letting it go. But the way the man stood there, looking down at him, his smugness palpable, lit something in Marcus's chest. He took a deep breath, refusing to let this moment ruin his day, but unwilling to just let the man walk all over him. "I had the right of way," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You almost caused an accident." The man laughed, a sharp, derisive sound that grated against Marcus's nerves. "An accident? You can't be serious." He leaned in closer, one hand resting casually on the top of Marcus's car. "I know how to drive, buddy. Maybe you're the one who needs to watch where you're going." Marcus felt a knot tightening in his stomach. The man's patronizing tone was bad enough, but what really got under his skin was the look in his eyes, the unspoken judgment, the assumption that Marcus didn't belong here, that he was somehow lesser. "Look," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin, "I don't know what your problem is, but you were in the wrong. You cut me off and almost caused a wreck." The man's smile faltered for a moment, but then he recovered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, I don't have a problem. In fact, I'm doing just fine." He straightened up, casting another glance at Marcus's car, his lips curling into a smirk. "Nice car, by the way." "Yours?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, it's mine. Really." The man looked Marcus up and down as if evaluating him. "Huh. Just don't see many people like you driving cars like that." Marcus felt a sharp sting at the comment, the man's words thick with insinuation. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he forced himself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on his appearance, and it likely wouldn't be the last. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the rising heat in his chest. The man chuckled again, this time quieter, more mocking. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean. Guys like you don't usually get these kinds of rides unless they're, I don't know, leasing? Maybe won a lottery ticket?" Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he could feel his pulse quickening again. He wasn't going to let this man's casual racism push him over the edge, but the urge to say something cutting, something sharp, rose in him. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus said, his voice low but controlled. The man leaned back slightly, still smirking. "Don't I? I've seen plenty of your type around. You get lucky, maybe land a decent job somewhere, but then it's all flash. No substance. Gotta show off, huh?" Marcus stared at him, the heat in his chest now burning hot. This wasn't about the parking spot anymore. It never had been. This was about the man standing in front of him, who saw nothing more than Marcus's skin color, and had decided he knew everything there was to know about him. "You should be careful," Marcus said quietly, his eyes locking with the man's. "You don't know who you're dealing with." For the first time, the man's smile wavered. He stepped back slightly, crossing his arms again, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Is that right?" he said, his voice no longer as confident as before. "Well, enjoy your day, while it lasts." With that, he tapped the roof of Marcus's car twice, a dismissive gesture that made Marcus's blood boil, and turned to walk back to his SUV. As he strolled away, he hummed a tune under his breath, completely unbothered by what had just transpired. Marcus sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, trying to push down the anger that threatened to boil over. He took a long, slow breath, reminding himself of what was important. This man didn't matter. The case he was about to fight in court did. Marcus forced himself to calm down. He parked his car in a different spot and turned off the engine, sitting in silence for a few moments to collect himself. He'd dealt with this kind of arrogance all his life, the kind that came not from overt hostility, but from the quiet, insidious kind that thought it didn't need to apologize, the kind that saw people like him as an anomaly in spaces like this. As Marcus stepped out of his car and grabbed his briefcase, he straightened his jacket and walked toward the courthouse, his mind already shifting to the task at hand. He couldn't let this distract him, not today. Today, he had a job to do, and he would do it well. Marcus strode through the courthouse lobby, the click of his polished shoes echoing off the marble floors. The oppressive heat from outside was replaced by the cool, sterile air of the building, but the tension from the parking lot encounter still lingered in the back of his mind. He focused on the case, mentally reviewing the points he would raise. Today's trial was important, not just for his client, but for him. As he approached the courtroom doors, he nodded at a few familiar faces, fellow lawyers who acknowledged him with curt, respectful gestures. This world was competitive, but Marcus had earned his place in it. He couldn't afford any distractions, least of all the unnecessary confrontation from earlier. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and scanned the room. The usual scene played out. The judge was seated at the bench, the court clerks and assistants buzzing around, setting up papers and equipment. Opposing counsel hadn't arrived yet. Marcus set his briefcase on the table and pulled out his notes, laying them out in an organized fashion. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors swung open again, and in walked Jonathan Price. Marcus froze, though his face gave away nothing. The man from the parking lot was his opposing counsel, Jonathan Price. Marcus had heard of him, a high-powered corporate attorney with a string of successful cases under his belt. But today, Price's swagger seemed just a little forced, his movements a touch too exaggerated as he greeted his colleagues and adjusted his cufflinks. Jonathan hadn't noticed Marcus yet, busy with his performance for the courtroom, basking in the attention as he strode confidently to the other side of the room. His back was to Marcus as he arranged his papers, oblivious to the connection they shared from earlier that day. Finally, Jonathan turned around and caught sight of Marcus. The shock was immediate and unmistakable. His hand faltered on his papers and the smug look from the parking lot quickly slipped away. For a moment, his expression froze, but he quickly recovered, smoothing his face into a neutral mask. Though Marcus could see the uncertainty flickering behind his eyes, Jonathan cleared his throat and gave a stiff nod. Well, looks like we're on opposite sides today," he said, trying to sound casual, but the forced politeness in his voice was impossible to miss. Marcus nodded in return, his expression steady. "Seems that way." Jonathan straightened his jacket and walked over, lowering his voice. "I didn't realize you were, earlier," Marcus cut him off. "It doesn't matter." His tone was firm, but controlled. "Let's focus on the case." Jonathan's eyes darted to Marcus's briefcase, his confidence shaken but still trying to assert some control. "Yeah, sure. Let's see how this plays out." Marcus watched Jonathan walk back to his table, his shoulders a little tenser than before. Jonathan had expected an easy win today, and now that certainty was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of who his opponent really was. The courtroom atmosphere shifted slightly, the undercurrent of their earlier encounter now woven into the air between them. As the judge called the court to order, Marcus mentally shifted gears. He wasn't here to settle personal scores. He was here to win a case. That was all that mattered. He had to push aside the satisfaction he felt at seeing Jonathan rattled and focus on what lay ahead. The real battle was about to begin. The judge began to address the court, outlining the basics of the case, and Marcus's attention zeroed in on every word. He had been preparing for this for weeks, gathering evidence, crafting arguments, and anticipating the opposition's moves. Now it was time to put everything into action. Jonathan rose first to present his opening argument. His voice, though loud and commanding, had lost some of the ease that had characterized it before. He stumbled slightly over a few words, but quickly recovered, shooting quick glances at Marcus as if gauging his reaction. Ladies and gentlemen, my client stands here today accused of misconduct they did not commit. What you'll see in the evidence we present is clear. There is no merit to these claims, and they should be dismissed in their entirety. Jonathan's voice regained some strength, though Marcus could hear the underlying tension. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes, his face impassive. Jonathan's argument was predictable, a standard corporate defense tactic. But as Jonathan spoke, Marcus noticed something. He was speaking faster than usual, rushing through certain points, as if trying to maintain control over the courtroom's attention. It was subtle, but it was there. When Jonathan finished, he sat down, his hands gripping the table just a little too tightly. Marcus could sense the cracks forming. Now it was his turn. Marcus stood straightening his tie as he approached the bench. He glanced at Jonathan briefly, noting the tightness in the man's jaw, before addressing the court. Your Honor, opposing counsel will attempt to paint this case as a simple misunderstanding, but what we're dealing with here is a clear pattern of behavior, one that has cost lives and livelihoods. Today we will show you the truth. His voice was calm and measured, each word deliberate. He wasn't here to grandstand or rush through his points like Jonathan. Marcus had the court's attention, and he would hold it. As he continued, Marcus saw Jonathan shift uncomfortably in his seat. Every time Marcus dismantled one of the corporate defenses Jonathan had raised, the tension in the room grew thicker. By the time Marcus finished, the shift in power was unmistakable. The courtroom quieted as Marcus returned to his seat, the echoes of his words still hanging in the air. Jonathan sat stiffly across from him, the earlier encounter from the parking lot now a distant memory. In this room, it wasn't about who drove what car. It was about who had control of the case, and Marcus was in control. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Jonathan Price prepared to deliver his opening argument. Marcus sat at the opposing counsel's table, his face calm but his eyes focused. He could see Jonathan across the room, straightening his papers with a little too much force, like a man trying to keep his hands from trembling. The parking lot encounter was clearly still lingering in Jonathan's mind. No matter how hard he tried to shove it aside, Jonathan rose, exuding confidence as he stepped toward the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice loud and commanding, but Marcus could hear the slight waver beneath the surface. Jonathan's usual poise wasn't all there. My client is a reputable corporation, operating within the full bounds of the law, Jonathan continued, pacing slowly, as though trying to regain his rhythm. The claims brought against them are exaggerated and unfounded, and today will prove that this is nothing more than a misunderstanding. Jonathan's argument was filled with the typical jargon and legal intricacies designed to confuse and overwhelm. He laid out his case confidently, at least on the surface, but Marcus noticed the subtle cracks. Jonathan stumbled slightly over a legal precedent, and though he quickly recovered, the misstep was noticeable. Marcus kept his gaze steady, watching as Jonathan glanced at him, almost reflexively, as if looking for a reaction. Marcus gave him none, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in Jonathan's eyes, a small but telling sign that the parking lot incident had already done more damage than Jonathan realized. As Jonathan wrapped up his opening statement, the tension in the room thickened. His argument had lacked the sharpness that Marcus had been expecting. Jonathan's usual ease and control were absent, replaced by something more frantic, more desperate. Jonathan returned to his seat with a forced smile, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Now it was Marcus's turn. He rose slowly, walking with deliberate calm to the center of the room. The contrast between his measured movements and Jonathan's earlier forced energy was palpable. Marcus knew he didn't need to rush or overwhelm. He just needed to let the facts speak. Your Honor, members of the jury, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. The facts in this case are straightforward. What my client has experienced is not a misunderstanding, but a clear pattern of negligence on the part of the defendant. Marcus laid out his argument methodically, each point crafted to undercut the defense Jonathan had just presented. He didn't use complex language or flashy tactics. He didn't need to. His argument was simple, logical, and precise. And as he spoke, Marcus noticed Jonathan shifting in his seat, the tightness in his jaw growing with every word. Where Jonathan had tried to overwhelm with details, Marcus chose clarity. He took his time, speaking to the jury with confidence, ensuring that each point resonated with them. As he did, Jonathan's agitation became more apparent. He was glancing at his notes, flipping through papers as though looking for something he missed, something that could help him regain control of the situation. But it was too late. Marcus continued, carefully deconstructing Jonathan's arguments piece by piece. Jonathan's earlier stumble over legal precedent hadn't gone unnoticed, and Marcus expertly pointed it out, subtly drawing attention to Jonathan's carelessness without sounding accusatory. Jonathan's face tightened further, his composure unraveling as he realized that Marcus had spotted every mistake he had made. By the time Marcus returned to his seat, the shift in power was clear. The jury, the judge, the entire courtroom. It all belonged to Marcus now. Jonathan's bravado from the parking lot was a distant memory, and the arrogance that had fueled him had now turned against him. He was losing, not just the case, but his grip on the courtroom. As the trial continued, Jonathan's missteps compounded. He missed key opportunities during cross-examination, rushed through important points in his closing statements, and even contradicted his own earlier argument. His frustration became visible, his face flushed, his voice more strained with each passing moment. Marcus, on the other hand, remained calm and poised, letting Jonathan's unraveling performance speak for itself. The earlier confrontation in the parking lot had clearly rattled Jonathan more than he wanted to admit, and now it was costing him dearly. Every time Jonathan glanced in Marcus's direction, it was as though he was reliving the moment when he'd underestimated the black man standing in front of him. By the end of the trial, Jonathan was a shadow of his former self. His once strong presence had withered under the weight of his own mistakes, and the jury could see it. The final nail in the coffin came when Marcus delivered his closing remarks, reaffirming his client's position with clarity and strength. There was no need for theatrics. Marcus had won by staying focused and composed, while Jonathan's own arrogance and bias had been his undoing. When the judge announced the verdict in favor of Marcus's client, Jonathan sat in stunned silence. His hands clenched the papers on his desk, but it was clear the fight had already left him. The man who had humiliated Marcus in the parking lot was now defeated, not just in court, but by his own blind prejudice. Marcus stood, collected his briefcase, and gave Jonathan a brief nod before walking out of the courtroom. His victory a quiet but powerful one. Jonathan, on the other hand, was left to reckon with the fact that his loss had started long before he ever stepped foot in the courtroom. The courtroom was emptying out, the tension from the trial still lingering in the air. Jonathan remained seated, his fingers tapping the edge of the table as the reality of his loss settled in. He had been rattled from the start, and Marcus's calm precision had only made it worse. Jonathan's mind replayed the earlier moments, the parking lot, the dismissive attitude he had carried into the courtroom. He had lost control long before the first argument was even made. Marcus was already making his way toward the exit, briefcase in hand, when Jonathan suddenly stood, the frustration and embarrassment boiling over. His steps were quick and deliberate as he approached Marcus just outside the courtroom doors. "Wait," Jonathan called, his voice tight, betraying the strain he was under. Marcus turned slowly, meeting Jonathan's eyes. He could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, the man still clinging to the arrogance that had been his undoing. Jonathan stepped closer, his words coming out in a rush. That was low," he spat. "You knew exactly who I was in the parking lot. You didn't say anything, just let you what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "Let you insult me? Assume things about me because of the car I was driving?" Jonathan's face reddened, but he struggled to form a response. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing he had no defense. Marcus had simply let him hang himself, and now the weight of his own prejudice had dragged him down. "You had no right," Jonathan finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was grasping for control, for anything that could lessen the blow of his defeat. You tricked me." Marcus shook his head, his calm gaze never wavering. "No, Jonathan, you tricked yourself." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low but carrying the weight of truth. "You lost that case because you underestimated me, just like you did in the parking lot. Maybe next time, you'll think twice about judging someone based on what you think you know." Before Jonathan could respond, a sharp voice broke through the tense silence. "Price!" Both men turned to see Jonathan's client, a sharply dressed executive storming toward them. His face was twisted in anger, his steps quick and heavy as he approached. "What the hell was that in there?" the client barked, eyes narrowing as he glared at Jonathan. "You told me this was a slam-dunk case. We were supposed to win, not get embarrassed in front of everyone. You couldn't even keep your head together." Jonathan took a step back, his face paling as the full force of the client's anger hit him. I had everything prepared," Jonathan stammered, trying to regain his composure. It was just what?" the client snapped, cutting him off. You were a disaster in there. You couldn't answer half the points he brought up. He gestured sharply at Marcus, who stood quietly observing the meltdown. And now, thanks to you, we've lost a major case. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost us? Jonathan swallowed hard, unable to meet the client's eyes. His earlier arrogance had completely crumbled, leaving him defenseless. The client shook his head, his disgust palpable. I trusted you with this. Your reputation was supposed to be ironclad, but apparently, I made a mistake. He stepped back, eyes cold. You're done. The firm's going to hear about this, and I'm pulling our account. Jonathan's face fell, all color draining as the client turned on his heel and walked away without another word. The final blow had been dealt, and Jonathan was left standing there, the full weight of his failure sinking in. Marcus watched the scene unfold, knowing that Jonathan's downfall was now complete. He gave Jonathan one last look, a mixture of pity and finality, before turning and walking toward the exit. He had no need to gloat. Jonathan had done that to himself. As Marcus left the courthouse, the afternoon sun washed over him, and with it came a sense of closure. The battle had been fought and won, but not just in the courtroom. It was the confrontation of attitudes, of assumptions, and of the consequences that always followed when arrogance met truth. Behind him, Jonathan stood alone, the echoes of his defeat lingering in the empty hallway. Jonathan Price stood in the courthouse hallway, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to suppress the urge to shout in frustration. His client's furious words still rang in his ears, echoing like a bad dream he couldn't shake off. The loss stung. More than that, it enraged him. He had been humiliated, not just by losing the case but by him, Marcus Williams, that smug, self-righteous look on his face. Jonathan's blood boiled just thinking about it. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been set up from the start. There was no other explanation. How else could things have gone so wrong? The trial had been rigged. The judge must have been biased. The jury swayed by Marcus's smooth-talking charm. Jonathan glared at the now empty courtroom, his mind racing to make sense of how everything had spiraled out of his control. He refused to believe that his own performance was the problem. He gathered his papers in a huff, stuffing them angrily into his briefcase. Every crinkle of the paper was like a reminder of his failure, and it only made him more bitter. He hadn't lost because of anything he had done. No, it was because of Marcus. That smug look, that calculated calmness. It had thrown him off. And now, his career was hanging in the balance because of it. Jonathan was halfway to the exit when a familiar voice called out behind him. Price! He turned, jaw already clenched, to see George Markham, one of the senior partners at the firm, approaching him with a face like thunder. Jonathan steeled himself. This was the last thing he needed right now. What the hell happened in there? Markham barked. His eyes narrowed. You told us this case was a sure thing. Instead, you got trampled. The client's pulling the account, and it's on your head. Jonathan's temper flared, but he swallowed it down, forcing a strained smile. It wasn't my fault, George. The opposing counsel. The opposing counsel? Markham cut him off, incredulous. You're telling me you let that guy get under your skin? You let him walk all over you? Jonathan's fists clenched again, the bitterness rising in his throat. It wasn't like that. He what, Jonathan? Markham's voice was ice. He outplayed you? You were supposed to be the top guy on this case, and you couldn't even hold it together in court. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck. He wanted to lash out, to blame the jury, the judge, anyone but himself. But Markham didn't give him the chance. The client's furious, and he's not the only one. The partners aren't happy either, Markham continued. His tone was sharp, cutting through Jonathan's attempts to defend himself. You were sloppy, and it cost us big. Jonathan's teeth ground together as he forced out, I had everything under control. He got lucky. Markham looked at him like he'd just said something ridiculous. Lucky? That's your excuse? Luck? You didn't lose because of luck, Jonathan. You lost because you weren't paying attention. You got rattled, and it showed. Jonathan's face flushed with anger. It wasn't his fault. It couldn't be. But he knew Markham wasn't going to listen to any excuses. Look, Markham said, his voice dropping to a colder, more final tone. You've done good work in the past, but today, you blew it. Big time. The partners are going to want to review your position here. For now, you're stepping back. We'll decide what happens next. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. But it wasn't fear. It was rage. He couldn't believe it. He was being sidelined because of that nobody Marcus. He hadn't lost the case because of his skills. It had been a fluke, a setup. Marcus had caught him off guard, played on some racial sympathy or something. That's what this was. That's why he lost. Fine, Jonathan snapped. the bitterness seeping into his voice. I'll step back, but don't think for a second this is on me. This was rigged from the start. Markham gave him a long, hard look, as if weighing whether Jonathan was worth responding to. Rigged? He scoffed. You can keep telling yourself that if it helps you sleep at night, but the truth is, you lost. And you better figure out how to bounce back, or this could be the end for you. With that, Markham turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan standing there, seething. His eyes burned with anger as he watched his boss disappear through the doors. Jonathan stormed out of the courthouse, barely aware of the people moving around him. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Marcus, of how that man had caused all of this. He couldn't let it go. Marcus had humiliated him, undermined him at every turn. There was no way this was over. He reached his SUV, the same one he'd arrogantly parked in front of Marcus's car earlier that day. It felt like another stab to the gut. He yanked the door open, throwing his briefcase into the passenger seat with more force than necessary. As he sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, Jonathan's jaw clenched tighter. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in his mind. The parking lot, the trial, the smug look on Marcus's face. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. He was Jonathan Price, a top lawyer in one of the city's most prestigious firms. He wasn't supposed to lose to someone like Marcus. Not in court, and definitely not in life. Bitter resentment burned in his chest, fueling his resolve. He wasn't going to let this go, not by a long shot. It had been a few weeks since Marcus Williams had seen Jonathan Price, and the memory of their previous encounters, first in the parking lot and later in court, had largely faded into the background of his busy schedule. Another day, another case, Marcus thought, as he stepped out of the courthouse and made his way toward the parking lot. The evening was still warm, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the nearly empty rows of cars. Marcus had been deep in thought, going over the details of an upcoming case, when he spotted a figure leaning against a familiar SUV parked a few spaces away from his own sedan. Jonathan Price. Marcus's stomach sank slightly, but he kept walking toward his car. Jonathan's posture screamed hostility. Arms crossed, his face barely visible in the shadow of the fading sun. But Marcus could already feel the man's resentment radiating from across the lot. Jonathan had clearly been waiting for him. As Marcus reached his car and pulled out his keys, Jonathan pushed himself off the SUV and stormed toward him. The weight of the situation hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Marcus didn't want another confrontation, but it looked like Jonathan had other plans. You think this is over, don't you? Jonathan spat, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. He was now just a few feet away from Marcus, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Marcus sighed, keeping his calm. I don't know what you want, Jonathan. We've been through this. You lost the case, and it's over. Let it go. Jonathan's face twisted with fury, and he took another step closer, his breath heavy with anger. Let it go? You humiliated me in that courtroom. You set me up from the beginning, nearly hit my car that day just to get in my head. Marcus frowned, his patience starting to wear thin. I didn't set you up, and I definitely didn't try to hit your car. You cut me off, Jonathan. You were already rattled long before we ever stepped into court. Jonathan's face reddened, his fists trembling as his anger boiled over. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? His voice was shaking now, his words slurring slightly as the bitterness took over. You think you can just walk away after everything you did to me? Marcus narrowed his eyes but kept his tone even. You did this to yourself. I didn't do anything to you, Jonathan. You lost the case because you underestimated me and weren't prepared. And now you're trying to blame me for your own failure. That was the last straw. Before Marcus could react, Jonathan swung a fist at him, his face twisted in blind rage. The punch caught Marcus off guard, hitting him hard in the shoulder and sending him stumbling back against his car. Pain shot through Marcus's arm as he steadied himself, the sudden shock of the attack causing his pulse to quicken. You're out of your mind, Marcus shouted, backing away, trying to distance himself from Jonathan's wild fury. But Jonathan wasn't done. Fueled by his anger and humiliation, he lunged at Marcus again, this time grabbing the collar of his jacket and shoving him hard against the side of the car. Marcus's heart raced, but he refused to escalate the situation further. Jonathan, stop! This isn't going to fix anything. Jonathan didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were wild, filled with a rage that had been simmering since the trial, his breath ragged and erratic. He raised his fist again, ready to strike. Before he could follow through, the blare of a siren cut through the tension. 2 police officers appeared at the far end of the lot, their car's blue and red lights flashing as they sped toward them. One of the officers shouted from the window, Hey, step away from him, now! Jonathan hesitated, his grip on Marcus loosening as he realized what was happening. The fury in his eyes flickered with confusion for a split second, but it wasn't enough to calm him down. As the police car skidded to a stop a few feet away, both officers jumped out, hands on their belts as they moved toward the two men. "I said step back," one of the officers repeated, his voice stern and commanding as he approached. Jonathan finally let go of Marcus, backing away slowly, his breath still coming in heavy bursts, his eyes darting between Marcus and the officers. Marcus straightened himself, rubbing his sore shoulder but staying silent, watching the scene unfold. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the second officer said, as they closed in on Jonathan. Jonathan held up his hands reluctantly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, his voice shaky. He provoked me." The first officer narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "You just assaulted him. We got a call from security about a disturbance. What's going on here?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "He attacked me. I didn't do anything to provoke him. This is the second time he's come after me, and this time it got physical." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them turned back to Jonathan, who was still glaring at Marcus. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to come with us," the officer said, his voice firm but calm. Jonathan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? You're arresting me? For this? You assaulted someone in broad daylight, right in front of security cameras," the officer said matter-of-factly. "You're lucky we didn't get here after things got worse." Jonathan's face twisted with rage again. But this time, there was a hint of desperation behind it. "You don't understand. He's been screwing with me since before the trial. This is all his fault." "Sir, calm down," the second officer said as they stepped toward him. "You can explain everything down at the station." Jonathan started to resist as one officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You can't arrest me for this. He's the one who started it." Marcus watched silently as the officers secured Jonathan's hands behind his back and led him toward the police car. Jonathan continued to struggle, his voice growing louder and more desperate with each step. "You'll regret this, Williams," Jonathan shouted as he was pushed into the back of the police car. "You think this is over? It's not over." The officers closed the door on Jonathan's ranting and turned back to Marcus. "Are you all right, sir?" one of them asked, his tone more relaxed now that the situation was under control. Marcus nodded, rubbing his sore shoulder again. "I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in when you did." "Do you want to press charges?" the officer asked, eyeing Marcus carefully. Marcus thought about it for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. Jonathan's career was already in free fall, and now he had gone and done something that would likely ruin whatever was left of it. Marcus had no sympathy for the man. Jonathan had chosen this path and was now facing the consequences. "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I want to press charges." The officers nodded and took Marcus's statement before heading back to the police car. As they drove away, the flashing lights of the squad car disappeared into the distance, leaving Marcus standing alone in the parking lot. The confrontation was finally over, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last he would hear of Jonathan Price. As he got into his car, his mind already returning to the work ahead of him, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever Jonathan tried next, Marcus wouldn't let it slow him down. Jonathan had lost the case, his composure, and now his freedom. But Marcus was already moving forward, leaving him, and the bitterness that came with him, far behind. It had been a few days since the parking lot altercation, and Marcus Williams found himself at the police station, ready to follow through on his decision to press charges against Jonathan Price. The incident still played in his mind. Jonathan's wild punch, the rage in his eyes, and the chaos that followed when the police had intervened. Marcus had never wanted things to escalate this far, but Jonathan had left him with no choice. Marcus stood at the counter, filling out the necessary paperwork with calm precision. The station bustled with activity, officers coming and going, phones ringing, and the low hum of conversation filling the air. Despite the noise, Marcus felt a sense of quiet resolution. He had made the decision to press charges, and he wasn't going to back down. A young officer approached him, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Williams?" she asked, confirming his identity. "I see you're here to press charges regarding the incident with Jonathan Price." "That's right," Marcus replied, handing over the completed paperwork. The officer nodded, glancing over the forms. "I'll need to ask you a few more questions for the report. After that, we'll process everything, and Mr. Price will be formally notified. Have a seat, and we'll get started." Marcus sat down in a small, worn chair near the counter, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. He had dealt with Jonathan's bitterness in the courtroom, and then again in the parking lot. Now this was the final step, holding Jonathan accountable for the physical assault. As he waited, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how things had spiraled. Jonathan had let his resentment and arrogance fester, unable to accept his loss in court. The trial had rattled him, but instead of learning from it, Jonathan had become consumed by his need to blame someone else for his failure. That had led to the confrontation, the punch, and now this, a police report that would follow Jonathan for the rest of his life. Marcus didn't feel any satisfaction from this. Pressing charges wasn't about revenge. It was about doing what was necessary. Jonathan had crossed a line, and there were consequences for actions like that. He couldn't just attack someone in a fit of rage and walk away as if nothing had happened. The officer returned, clipboard in hand, and gestured for Marcus to follow her to a small interview room. Inside, the space was sparse, just a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device set up in the corner. "Okay, Mr. Williams, let's go over the details of what happened," the officer said, sitting down across from him. "We want to make sure we've got everything on record." Marcus recounted the events clearly and calmly. He explained the encounter in the parking lot, the way Jonathan had approached him, the accusations, the punch that had caught him off guard, and the moment the police had arrived to break up the situation. The officer took notes, nodding as Marcus spoke, occasionally asking for clarification. "Do you feel like this was premeditated?" the officer asked at one point, glancing up from her notes. Marcus thought about it for a moment. "I think Jonathan had been stewing over his loss for a while. He clearly wasn't over what happened in court, and it all came to a head when he saw me in the parking lot. But I don't know if he came there intending to attack me. I think he just let his anger get the better of him." The officer nodded, scribbling down more notes. "And you're certain you want to proceed with the charges?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Yes. He assaulted me, and he needs to face the consequences for that." The officer made a final note, and then clicked off the recording device. "All right, Mr. Williams, that's everything we need for now. We'll move forward with the charges, and Mr. Price will be notified shortly. If there's anything else we need from you, we'll be in touch." Marcus stood, shaking the officer's hand. "Thank you for your time." As he left the police station, Marcus felt a sense of closure beginning to settle in. The process wasn't finished yet, but the hardest part, making the decision to press charges, was behind him. Jonathan would have to face the reality of what he'd done. Marcus got into his car and sat for a moment, staring at the police station in his rearview mirror. He knew this wasn't just about a single punch or a parking lot altercation. Jonathan's arrogance and inability to accept responsibility for his own actions had led him to this point, and now he would pay the price for it. Marcus started the engine, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The path ahead was clear. He had done the right thing. Jonathan's career and future were now in the hands of the legal system, where they belonged. Marcus had more important things to focus on: his work, his clients, his life. He drove away from the station, leaving the weight of the past behind him. Whatever happened next with Jonathan, it wasn't Marcus's concern anymore. The world moved on, and so would he. A few more weeks had passed since Marcus Williams had pressed charges against Jonathan Price, and the incident had begun to fade into the background of his busy life. Marcus had plenty of cases to focus on, new challenges to tackle, and little time to dwell on what had happened in that courthouse parking lot. But today, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing documents for an upcoming trial, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his colleagues. He glanced down and read the text. "Looks like Jonathan Price is out. Word is he was fired this morning. Couldn't keep up after that parking lot mess." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the news settling over him. Jonathan Price, the man who had once arrogantly strutted through the courtroom, thinking he was untouchable, had finally met his downfall. Marcus wasn't surprised. It was a long time coming, and anyone who had watched Jonathan spiral over the past few months would have seen it too. Marcus set his phone down, feeling no need to respond to the message. He wasn't shocked, nor did he feel any sense of vindication. Jonathan had done this to himself. From the moment he had underestimated Marcus in the parking lot before the trial, to the moment he had swung that punch, Jonathan had been on a collision course with his own failure. Word must have gotten around the legal community by now. Jonathan had been slacking off for weeks, missing deadlines, losing clients, and making more excuses than efforts. He had been too consumed with his bitterness and pride to focus on what mattered, his job. When Marcus had pressed charges, it was just the tipping point. No firm could afford to keep someone who had become a liability, both professionally and legally. The truth was, Marcus had seen men like Jonathan before. Men who were so used to getting what they wanted, to having the world cater to their every whim, that they couldn't handle even the smallest taste of failure. And when that failure came, they self-destructed. Marcus took a deep breath, gazing out the window of his office. The sky was clear, the city humming with its usual energy. But Marcus felt a sense of quiet finality. He had done what needed to be done. He had stood his ground, pressed charges, and let the legal process take over. Jonathan had tried to blame everyone but himself for his downfall, but now there was no one left to blame. Jonathan Price had been fired. His career, once promising and full of potential, was over, and there was no one to blame but Jonathan himself. Marcus felt no pity for him. There was no sense of regret or reflection, just the simple reality that Jonathan's arrogance, his inability to take responsibility for his actions, had led him here. Marcus had long since moved on from the trial and the confrontation in the parking lot. He had more important things to focus on: clients to help, cases to win, and a career that was still on the rise. He picked up his phone again, sending a brief reply to his colleague. Not surprised. It was bound to happen. After setting the phone back down, Marcus returned to his work. Jonathan was just a memory now. Another lesson in what happened when pride and ego outweighed common sense and professionalism. Marcus wouldn't waste any more time thinking about him. As Marcus dove back into his casework, he felt a sense of closure. Jonathan's firing was the final chapter in a story that had been written long before the punch in the parking lot. But now that chapter was closed, and Marcus was ready for what came next. Jonathan Price might have lost everything, but Marcus was still moving forward. And that more than anything was what mattered.